What does death mean? Why are we afraid of dying? What happens after death? Not at the sun, not at death. You can't look too close to it. This is a quote by French writer and philosopher François La Rochefoucauld. This quote perfectly describes man's attitude toward death. Death, as it was centuries ago, remains the central mystery of human life. Among all philosophical problems, it turns out to be the closest and most understandable. Everyone in the course of their lives encounters it in one way or another. We experience the death of others, but we try not to think about our own death. Most of our lives, we don't remember it. It is more important to decide where to go on vacation or what phone to buy. Along with this, the thought of one's own death is frightening and even paralyzing. What's the point of doing anything if it's going to end sooner or later anyway? It seems impossible to fully imagine one's own death. Such a thought simply does not fit into the human mind, like the idea of infinity or emptiness. Meanwhile, the realization of one's own mortality is that rare phenomenon that unites absolutely all people. If you think about death, it's so scary. Maybe we shouldn't do it at all. Leave it to philosophers for whom thinking about death is part of their profession. It is hard to find a thinker who would ignore the subject of death. Today, we will try to understand how philosophers of different eras have understood death and how this can help us. In the Dialogue of Phaedon, the ancient Greek philosopher Plato puts a famous sentence into the mouth of Socrates. Those who are truly devoted to philosophy are concerned with only one thing: the death and dying of things. According to Plato's theory of ideas, the whole world is divided into ideas and things. Ideas are eternal and unchanging and can only be known by the mind, while things are only shadows of ideas. They are inaccessible to sense perception. The philosopher must strive to go beyond the world of things to get closer to the truth. It is at the moment of death that the immortal soul truly approaches the world of ideas. This means that death is not a tragedy, but the liberation of the soul from the prison of the body. In ancient thought, death is illusory. It is only a transition from one state to another, which is not to be feared. In late antiquity, for example, several philosophical schools argue that it is pointless to fear death. Epicurus notices a paradox. When we exist, death is not yet there. And when death comes, we are no longer there. We encounter the death of others, but the experience of our own death is not available to us, which means there is no point in fearing it. Stoicism offers us a view of death as the cessation of all sensation. Before we were born, we felt nothing. For some reason, however, this does not bother us. After death, we will return to that state, and there is nothing wrong with that. Death itself is not a matter of compassion. The culture of the European Middle Ages has a very different view of death. The whole essence of the medieval view of death is reflected in the Danse Macabre, the dance of death. This is a famous theme in painting and literature. Death leads to the grave, a round dance of people of various ranks and estates. This is how the inevitability of death and the equality of all in the face of death is conveyed. Christianity is characterized by the idea of the dual nature of man. We have immortal souls and mortal bodies, and after death, God will resurrect the souls in new, more perfect and younger bodies. This approach to death was also reflected in funeral rites. If we go to Paris, for example, we will see that medieval cemetery pogosts were located in the center of the city, for example, in the market squares. They were not individual burials. They were mostly buried in mass graves. The body is not so important. A person should think more about the salvation of the soul. After the Reformation, attitudes towards man and death change again. A new time begins, an era of flourishing secular science, especially physics, biology, and medicine. Death is also conceptualized by science as a part of nature and a natural process of decay to which all living things are subject. Anatomical theater developed and the practice of embalming spread. Death becomes a scientific problem, and scientists once again turn to the search for the philosopher's stone, the elixir of immortality. Remember the plot of the first Harry Potter book, in which the alchemist Nicholas Flamel lived to the end of the 20th century with the help of this stone. With the development of medicine, people realized that a dead body is a source of contamination, and since then the cemetery has been outside the city limits. In the new era, however, death is seen not only as a biological phenomenon, but also as a social one. It is a process that, although intimate, usually takes place in full view of others. Therefore, in the art and culture of the new era, the idea of a dignified death without pain in one's own bed, surrounded by relatives, appears. Or a brave death for honor, duty. At the same time, the philosophers of the new time sounded a new idea of social or symbolic immortality, not directly connected with resurrection. One can continue to live in one's descendants, disciples, good deeds, creativity, or memory. New Age philosophy affirms the unconditional value of human life. This becomes a turning point in the development of all European thought. In the early 20th century, the Russian and Soviet psychoanalyst Sabina Spielrein described the phenomenon of the death drive in her doctoral dissertation. According to Spielrein, a person unconsciously tries to destroy his own self. He tries to dissolve into a common we. Frey would later build his concept of the two main driving forces of human life around this concept, the sexual urge and the urge to die. Freud wrote that we only realize the value of phenomena when we realize that they are not eternal. This idea went down in history as Eros and Thanatos, although Freud himself did not call the attraction to death Thanatos. This was later done by the Austrian psychoanalyst Wilhelm Stiekel. Modern researchers of Soviet culture describe a special attitude to death, which has been called red Thanatos. It is understood as a striving for heroic death in the name of a common goal. As the Soviet poet Konstantin Fedin wrote, death with glory and honor is not a sacrifice but a feat. The horrors of the First and Second World Wars, the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Holocaust, all this radically changed the idea of the philosophy of death. Perhaps no philosopher has paid as much attention to the topic of death as the existentialists. In 1945, Jean-Paul Sartre gave a lecture, "Existentialism is Humanism." He argued that in facing despair and death, a person finds true freedom and realizes what is really important to him. This is why existentialism teaches us to think about death more often. Today, death is becoming more of a medical mystery. Transhumanist philosophers believe that it is not necessarily a stage of life or an existential category, but a problem to be solved by science. But first, we must understand what death is. By what criteria can we tell for sure that a person is dead? This seemingly simple question is the reason for the intense debate in bioethics. Today, death is becoming, among other things, a matter of technology. You can keep a person alive in a coma or in a vegetative state. You can keep the heart of the lungs working artificially. But what about the brain? Are these people alive if their consciousness is no longer functioning? Hence, the main criterion of death today appears cessation of consciousness work. Does this mean that death can be defeated by retaining consciousness? There are two basic solutions here. The first is to upgrade the body, to make it immortal, that is, to become a cyborg. Replace the heart with an uninterrupted mechanism and arms and legs with perfect biological prostheses. Maybe science fiction isn't as far from reality as it seems. The second option arises from the fact that another important sign of life, at least social life, is participation in communication. This is how famous people can make a statement after their death, and we get worried if our acquaintance has not been online for a long time. The idea of digital immortality or transferring consciousness to an external medium is emerging. Who does death come to, and what does it want to take away? As history shows, the idea of death changes every time the question of human nature is solved in a new way. It's death that helps us realize our own uniqueness. It is the realization of our mortality that makes us feel alive and gives life meaning. Thanks for watching. If you liked this episode, give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe and share with friends.